Hello, everybody. Welcome to Digital Hammurabi. My name is Megan Lewis, for those who are joining us for the first time, and I run the channel along with my husband, Dr. Joshua Bowen. Today, I'm very excited to have Dr. Joel Baden with me to talk about the Museum of the Bible and the various reasons why it's been in the headlines quite so much over the past few years. Most recently, I believe last week, over a Gilgamesh tablet. Dr. Baden received his BA from Yale University in Judaic Studies, his MA from the University of Chicago in Northwest Semitics, and his PhD from Harvard University in, again, the Hebrew Bible. He is professor of Hebrew Bible at the Yale Divinity School and has written on infertility in the Bible with Dr. Candida Moss, the redaction of the Pentateuch, and his most recent publication is Bible Nation, the United States of Hobby Lobby, also written with Dr. Moss. Dr. Baden, welcome to Digital Hammurabi. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Just to start off, this is something I ask pretty much everyone. Could you just introduce yourself and tell us how you got into the field of Hebrew Bible?
Sure. So as you can tell from just the list of degrees you just went through, I've been on a relatively focused track ever since college, right? I went to college with the intention of studying Judaism, specifically rabbinics. I found myself as I was growing up and I was sort of becoming aware of sort of the texts of my own tradition, I read the way that the rabbis were playing with the biblical text, and I thought, oh, that's really neat. I'm like really interested in that intellectually, you know, the way they're manipulating text and interpreting. And I went to Yale for the purpose of studying what I thought was going to be studying rabbinics, and I discovered that in fact the study of rabbinics is not nearly as fun as actually just reading them, and that if what I was interested in was playing with the biblical text, I probably should just go into Bible.
There was a lot of Bible to do that with, yeah.
And so, you know, halfway through my my undergrad, I realized that I was interested in Bible and not in the rabbis, and so just sort of kept on that that trajectory. You know, I found myself in my master's program, and even after that, getting really just interested in particularly the pre-exilic period and questions of composition, specifically having to do with the Pentateuch. So it's been a relatively straight path of just, you know, I find the text to be you know, sort of an ever unfolding mystery, which is a very flowery way of saying that. It's like a really good puzzle.
Yeah.
And you know, it's the puzzler in me that likes to play with the words, and there it is.
I was actually talking to someone about this yesterday. It's an absolutely fascinating document. And I'm not a Hebrew biblicist, but I do feel like everything I learn about the Hebrew Bible and about Israelite religion just brings up more questions and more things that I want to know more about and look into. Before we get into the interview proper, I do want to remind our viewers, if you have questions for Dr. Baden, we will be taking them. I'll save them all until the end. So please put them in the side chat and tag me at Digital Hammurabi so I see them. If you don't tag me, I do not promise that I will be able to see them, so your question may be missed. So please, if you have questions, go for it. Now, Dr. Baden, you've written various articles and a book even about the Museum of the Bible, and its somewhat complex relationship with the Green family, who a lot of people may know own the US chain store Hobby Lobby, and also the objects that the Museum of the Bible has on display. How exactly did you get involved in that research?
Yeah, it has like very little to nothing to do with my sort of scholarly training or the things that I generally tend to write about, but at a certain point a few years ago, my co-author Candida Moss and I, we had started writing for sort of a more popular audience, and trying to get at issues around the Bible that were popping up in the news that were of sort of more general interest. And the first one that worked for us was the what was known at the time as the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. Right, which this turned out to be forged document, but that got a huge amount of attention. And we wrote an article about that for The Atlantic, just talking about what was happening there. And we sort of kept our eye out for other things that might be worth bringing to the public's attention. and we were at a sort of our annual conference in November of, I think, 2014. And Canada was having drinks with one of her classmates, her graduate classmates, who was a papyrologist, or someone who works with ancient manuscripts, and who offhandedly mentioned, you know, I wanted to find this one thing, but I couldn't have access to it because Hobby Lobby owns it. And this is before anybody really had any idea that any of that was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And her reaction was like, you mean Hobby Lobby, like the craft store? She tells that story better than I do. But in any case, you know, she quickly got down as much information from him as she could, and the two of us thought, well, you know, we thought there's a story here. It's just a story about what a weird combination of like a known person, that is the Hobby Lobby family, and like our field. How weird that they've started collecting antiquities, but okay. And then we discovered it was going to be, they were planning on building a museum, and then we discovered how much they had bought. And you know, originally the only question we had was like, why is Hobby Lobby interested in buying these things? And it was really a question of sort of what is the evangelical community's investment in like tangible artifacts of the Bible, right? That was sort of the first thing we started with. And it was just going to be an article for The Atlantic, which it was. And in the course of researching that article and interviewing and meeting Steve Green, who's the president of Hobby Lobby and the founder of the museum, and like talking to all the people and going to the site, and we discovered that this was much more than just an article about sort of why are evangelicals interested in biblical artifacts. There was this massive thing going on that involved, you know, collection and a museum and all these scholars who it turned out were being hired to work on their material, and a curriculum that was being developed for teaching the Bible in public school. I mean, there's this whole world that we, you know, had just barely scratched the surface of. And so that's how we ended up writing the book.
No, that's fascinating. And I'm actually planning on, because there's so much of it, and even just tracking down different newspaper articles, I feel like they're just like snapshots. So I am going to get the book so I can like read it in its entirety and have a much better understanding of exactly what's going on here, because it's a long and kind of complex story.
Yeah, and so much has happened even since the book came out.
So can you give us a brief overview of like the museum, like what its purpose is, what kind of things they're trying to do?
Yeah, it depends who you ask and when you ask them. You know, the museum and the collection of antiquities sort of came into being conceptually at the same time. That is, they only started buying, the Green family, Hobby Lobby, only started buying artifacts when they decided that they were going to sort of put them in a museum. So the museum has really been the driving factor here. And the notion was essentially the more people you can get in to get up close to the Bible in all of its various manifestations, from papyrus fragments to modern versions to the King James, right? The Bible, and this is a relatively well-known sort of evangelical position, the Bible will sort of exert a power on people. Like it will draw people to it. And simply by being in its presence, there will be the language they use is, right, we invite people to engage with the Bible. So, I mean, that's the underlying idea, was like, get people to the Bible and let the Bible do its work. But of course, along the way, it's essentially just a massive celebration of the Bible as well, not just its sort of textual history, but, you know, there's displays about the Bible and food, the Bible and fashion, so that, you know, the Bible's influence on politics, the Bible's influence especially on America, a massive section on sort of, you know, where the Bible has made an impact in their minds in American history. So, you know, famous quotes that invoke the Bible, etc. So, you know, they've got this very sort of, I don't know, white bread kind of like, you know, we're gonna just come in and engage with the Bible. It's very, it's no big deal, right? Like, whatever.
Kind of harmless.
Yeah, harmless. But when they like first started their original, right, because they're a nonprofit, the museum's a nonprofit organization, they have to sort of do, you know, filings for the government. to keep their status. And one of the things they had to say is what the purpose is. And for the first couple of years that it existed, the purpose that they stated in their tax filings was essentially something like to inspire people to understand that the word of God is absolutely verifiably historically true.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that it doesn't say that anymore. but that is where they started, and it is. I mean, it's the position that they hold, right? That's their that's the Green family's belief, and they have. I assume that they still do. For a long, long time, they made employees, or at least very high-level board members, sign a statement of faith in order to be part of the organization that affirmed. It's the same kind of statement that you find at many sort of fundamentalist evangelical churches. So there's two things going on, right? There's like the private, what we want the museum to be, and there's the public, like this is just a museum for everybody. Everybody's Bible is very welcome here, and those two things are often somewhat in conflict.
So from reading the various articles that you and that Dr. Moss have written, you come out with a very clear understanding that the Greens have a very set idea of what the Bible is and its transmission history from like point A to point B. And they don't really diverge an awful lot from that kind of Protestant evangelical mindset. As someone who studies the Bible, how, I don't want to say how accurate is that, but because
but
it's not.
How frustrating is that?
Yes, let's go with how frustrating is that.
You know, the thing about the Bible that I think most people recognize, I hope, is that it is, right? There's nothing uniform or linear about it, right? It's a library, it's a collection. It spans 1,000+ years, all kinds of sociological and cultural contexts for its various, parts and points of composition. The interesting thing about what the Museum of the Bible does is, though they are a museum that reportedly is about, you'd think a Museum of the Bible might tell you something about the Bible's history.
Maybe.
They don't. They will tell you that they will show you occasionally little things that sort of point to historical moments in the Bible. Look, here's a pottery fragment from X period that is like when this was happening. Or with the cuneiform stuff, right? They'll say, look, here is evidence of writing in the ancient Near East at the time when maybe Moses was living. They don't say that out loud, but they did in their curriculum.
They're thinking it.
They don't do it. They're thinking it. But effectively, there's not a single word in anything that they produce about how the Bible came into being, right? The process of its composition, where it came from, when it came from. They start with the Bible. Right? Like, poof, there it is. And then what they're interested in is its transmission history and its translation history, right? So we have the Bible. Dead Sea Scrolls are great, right? With Dead Sea Scrolls, you've got the Bible, right? Fragments of the biblical text, the earliest ones we have. But they don't really comment much on, what most scholars do with the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is say, wow, look at how fluid the text of the Bible was, even, in the 1st, 2nd centuries BC, right? There were like all sorts of versions floating around. We have multiple texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have one version of Samuel and another version of Samuel, and they're very different, and that's wild, right? The text wasn't fixed. It was still in flux in the process of composition and transmission. So, no, the Dead Sea Scrolls are evidence that the Bible existed.
It's just the Bible.
And look at how close, and what they say is, look at how close it is to our Bible, right? Like, the Bible has been consistent for all of this time. And then from there on, it's just, and then we've got versions here, and look at, here's a Greek translation, here's this translation. And of course we get, Jerome in Latin, and Luther is a highlight, and Wycliffe translating into English is an even better highlight, because that's where we get the King James, which is the highlight of all the Bibles, right? So they've got, again, they do have a very linear sense of like the Bible started with the Bible, and then it got translated and transmitted and copied and recopied and preserved, and right, like they've got like, you know, we've written about, they've got like literally a rabbi, right, a trained Jewish Torah scroll scribe who sits in the museum copying a Torah scroll, like
as
on
an
display.
exhibit.
Like yeah, kind of like a living exhibit. He's on display. He'll chat with the people, like, but he's literally sitting there doing the work as a demonstration of like the process of pristine, precise textual copying that's been going on. It's
for the whole of the Bible's textual history.
For the whole of the Bible's history, even though in fact we know that like that kind of copying is not real. Anyway, so it's so they've got a very linear sense of development, right? And translated and finally translated into English. Hooray! King James, right? Like, and then you get the angelic voices, and like that's the story of the Bible, is its development, and it follows quite precisely a path that goes Judaism, Catholicism, Protestantism. Yay! Right? Like, so it's you know, they don't do none of the complications are part of the story, and the complications are the story.
And it's much, I think it's a much more interesting story when you have the complications included, and when you have the fluidity of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and people can understand actually this is something that's really fascinating and has been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, and what we have as the Bible is just the last line, or the last kind of publication, kind of compilation in a very long line of texts.
And of course, you know, even just use the phrase the Bible doesn't really make any sense, right? Like, we use that as shorthand, but the King James Bible is not the Bible that I read.
No.
Neither, it's not in the right, you know, it's not in the right language, and it doesn't have the right books in the right order, right? It's a very different kind of thing, and it's, you know, and it's got typos, right? Like there are mistakes, and you know, the text it's based on has mistakes, and so it's just super messy as a thing, which is I think where it becomes a really interesting book to read.
Yeah, thank you. When I was doing prep for this interview, the two things that really jumped out at me was how fast the Greens acquired a very extensive collection of antiquities, and also just how many scandals those antiquities have been involved in. Would you comment on that for me?
Sure. They decided to start collecting in 2009, and by 2010 they were at 30,000 to 40,000 items, which is outrageous.
That's huge.
It's now. Some of those, it's not like 30,000 individual sales. Sometimes they would buy some other person's 10,000 piece collection, right? And we have to remember, they're not just buying antiquities or artifacts, right? They're buying things like Elvis's Bible or Johnny Cash's Bible, like, which is, you know, these are things that they have on display at the museum. You know, those are the kinds of things that are in collections of people who like collect Americana or, American religious stuff. But they were also buying, as we now know, 5,500 pieces of cuneiform, in one go. So, you know, what happens if you buy that fast, especially when you know nothing about collecting, is you have to trust the people who you sort of assign to do this for you, right? And the Queens found one guy who said, actually, he found them. The whole thing was his idea, a guy named Scott Carroll, who was the one who went to the Greens and said, I think you guys should buy antiquities and put them in a museum. And they said, okay, you find them for us. It's what he'd been doing for a while. He was sort of self-proclaimed Indiana Jones style figure. It turns out that he simply had no scruples about getting stuff from anywhere and anyone. And so it's not just, we bought a 10,000 book collection of stuff, bought a bunch of cuneiform, but it's also, we sent our agent to to like a shady collector's apartment in London, and he came back with a backpack full of unmarked papyri with no like legitimate paperwork for their purchase or origin.
And this didn't ring any bells for the Greens, apparently.
Ring any bells for them at all. Now, so as you said, over the course of the last, 6 years or so, I guess, it has become clearer and clearer that there was less and less sort of due diligence being done, especially at the beginning. And the earliest of these sort of red flags was picked up by Roberta Mazza, who is a papyrologist in England, in Manchester, who was at a display of green collection items at the Vatican. They had aligned with the Vatican to do this display, and she was walking around their stuff, and she saw a particular papyrus from the book of Galatians, and she looked at it and she thought, I saw that on eBay last year.
Oh, wow. Because,
she follows the like illegal trading of these things on eBay. And so she started to ask questions, and it actually took a long time for that story is actually not completely finished yet. She raised questions. They didn't really answer them. We raised questions. They didn't really answer them. They said, oh no, it's weird that it was on eBay, but we have a perfectly good provenance for it. It went through this. It was in this collection. As we've noted a number of times, it took us about 10 minutes of phone calls to determine that the provenance that they had for this particular piece was nonsense. That didn't mean we knew where it came from, but it was clear that it wasn't legitimate. But again, part of the problem was that they simply refused to give us any information, or give anyone any information about not only where the stuff they had came from, but what stuff they had. The things that they put on display. This is before the museum opened. But even the museum only displays a couple thousand items, and they own 40,000. So what is all the other stuff? Turns out a lot of it was, little bits of cuneiform that nobody really wants to look at. But so it's been a sort of a slow process of one thing after another. The big break was when we were researching the book, and it was mentioned to us that there was a federal investigation going on of illicit importation of antiquities by Hobby Lobby. And it turns out that this was what became the first of the very big federal cases, where they said, this 5,500 pieces of cuneiform that the Greens had flown to Abu Dhabi, I think, to negotiate a purchase with some Israeli dealers who clearly no provenance, no nothing. Here's just like a whole chunk of stuff, and they did so despite the fact that they had been specifically told, you cannot do this kind of thing. You absolutely must always have good paperwork. You can't trust people. But this was still early days. They were collecting everything, and they weren't really asking the questions. And it's just, as you said, it's been a constant stream of one thing after another, repatriating, sending back items that had been that they had purchased without knowing. They had an item that had been stolen. They hadn't stolen it, obviously. They had purchased it, but they simply never did the due diligence to find out what they had. And again, I'm sure we'll get to it, to the most recent example. But just an example of the kinds of issues they were dealing with. We were talking to one of their higher level administrators who said, like in my office, I've got like a couple of crates that are just full of loose papyri with no paperwork.
Oh, wow.
And, that's the kind of collecting that they were doing in the early days, and that's the kind of stuff that keeps coming out and that they keep having to clean up.
That's, yeah. As a scholar of the ancient world that is creates a papyri in an office with no provenance is
I know.
It's interesting.
It's brutal because not only does that mean that there's a trafficking in this stuff, which means probably looting and there's probably all sorts of nasty things going on, but also much of that is now going to be relatively worthless. I mean, you know, right, that the artifacts are only good when are only really good when they've got provenance.
Yeah.
And so it's, you know, these things have just sort of gone to waste.
So related to that, why, for the academic community, for like the wider world at large, why is it so important for collectors to pay attention to provenance when they're purchasing? Like, why is buying off eBay or from just dealers that you meet in a London flat somewhere so very problematic?
Right. So there's two reasons. One is intellectual and one is more sociological. Provenance is important from the intellectual perspective, that is from the sort of scholarly academic perspective, because you can't really understand what a thing is, even a text, if you don't know where it comes from. Mm-hmm. Right? We all want archaeological, especially for something like cuneiform, you always want archaeological context. Right? I need to know where it came from. Did it come out of, you know, which plot of ground did it come out of, and how does that help me date it and understand it? So items that are lacking in that context are lacking really half of what they can tell us in terms of like the data about the past. So that's, you know, when you get something without context, it's only worth so much to the community. Now, there are plenty of scholars who are happy to read a text without any provenance, mm-hmm. Because it's not like it tells you nothing. But provenance is a very important part of what we can know, or what a text can, or an artifact of any kind can teach us. Also, obviously, if it comes with provenance, and I mean the kind of provenance like I know where in the ground it came from, I also know it's real.
Yeah.
Right? If it comes out of the ground, like I'm pretty sure, unless somebody
it wasn't locked up in a workshop somewhere,
right?
Again,
Exactly.
A London apartment or something.
We have so many cases of forgeries, not just related to the Museum of the Bible, but I mean, forging of antiquities, especially from that part of the world, is huge business. So insisting on provenance means that we can get rid of the problem of forgeries. But it's not the case that we should assume that the worst thing that you can have is a forgery. In my mind, at least, the worst thing you can have is a unprovenanced black market artifact that is real. To me, that's worse than a forgery. A forgery is a dirty trick that somebody pulled. A legitimate unprovenanced artifact is probably stolen. Mm-hmm. And this is the sociological argument against dealing with unprovenanced artifacts. There's a whole chain of bad behavior that is associated with the production of and the bringing to light of an unprovenanced artifact. So in order for an unprovenanced artifact to have appeared on the Museum of the Bible's display, so first it had to have been looted from somewhere. It did not come from an archaeological dig, right? Somebody went and dug it up or stole it from somewhere. So that's the first mm-hmm. problem. And then they sold it to somebody who sold it to someone who sold it to someone. And all those people are knowingly trafficking in stolen goods. And then eventually it is going to be purchased by a collector. Mm-hmm. And the collector may or may not know that it's, you know, the history of its dirtiness, but they will know because they're buying it on the market that it can't have, you know, come from
it wasn't excavated properly.
Right, it wasn't excavated, right? And if they can't trace it back to when it was excavated, or to, you know, the collection, obviously there are collections of antiquities from the 19th century, when, you know, Napoleon goes through Egypt and picks up stuff, and now it comes mm-hmm. on the market. Okay, yeah. But if it's, you know, relatively recent and it doesn't have a really good history, it probably, especially given the, you know, problems in the Near East, it was probably looted during a period of unrest, which is to say, always. So now a collector purchases it, thereby putting a, you know, a pretty good price on it and making everything that came before it worthwhile. And the collector probably, and this is the case, this is what the Greens did, right? The Greens had their stuff and then they gave them to scholars to study. And now the scholar is taking an artifact and probably not even bothering to ask whether it's provenanced or not, and studying it and writing it up and often publishing it. And that's what the Greens were trying to do. They said, study this and feel free to publish it. You get the publication credit. And what do the Greens get? The Greens get a now much more highly valued object because it has scholarly, you know, approval and evaluation attached to it. I now know it's not just a piece of cuneiform, it's this piece of cuneiform, right?
Yeah.
So scholarly publication does an enormous amount for raising the value of an artifact. And now the collector says, I have this object, and it was, I have had it studied, and I know what it is, and it's, and now I'm going to donate it. And they donate it to a museum, and when they donate it to a museum, it now gets another stamp of approval. It's in a museum, and more importantly, excuse me while I remove my cat from the premises. Welcome to coronavirus.
Oh yes.
Now that it's in a museum, now I'm donating it to a museum. I'm donating it for this now inflated value because it's been published. And by donating it, I, the collector, get a tax write-off. So I financially benefit, especially if I purchased it on the relatively cheap. And then I had it studied and published, and then I donated it at a higher cost. I can actually make money on this. So the collector is incentivized financially, and by purchasing it, and with the scholar studying it and the museum displaying it, the looting in the first place is incentivized. And so anybody who deals with unprovenanced artifacts, even if they say, I'm just a scholar, I don't know where it came from, I'm just, you know, interested in it for
it's not my responsibility.
I'm only interested in what I can learn from it intellectually. You're participating in a chain that goes back to the like original sin here of looting. And it's a pretty nasty business, all things considered. Point is, no one should be dealing with unprovenanced artifacts at this point at all.
Yeah.
Right? If you can show me that the provenance has a reasonable history of ownership, that kind of provenance that goes back, and I can say I can see where this came from and when it came from, and like there's nothing we can do about the fact that, you know, colonialists looted all of Mesopotamia in the 19th century or Egypt. Fine, that is what it is. But that there's a current market, right? There's a current market that is being driven by collectors like the Greens. And there's a current tax system that they're taking advantage of. That makes it sort of the whole thing worthwhile.
Why don't we talk briefly about how the Gilgamesh Dream Tablet plays into all of this? Because one of the things that struck me when reading about it was quite how much its value went up after it had been published.
It's the whole story. That tablet does everything I just said. That tablet is a really good example of, right? So the federal government did a really nice job of laying out sort of the chain of what happened here. But essentially, though we don't know when and where it was looted from, patently looted from somewhere in Iraq, sometime probably in the last 20 years. And it was sold to someone who sold it to someone who forged a document about, it having been in an earlier collection, right? But a forgery that was evidently quite easy to check and disprove because people easily did that.
I mean, it's been done, right?
Because it has been done, and it was done, as far as I can tell, relatively swiftly. Again, in the same way that Candida and I were able, with 10 minutes of work, to disprove an equally forged provenance. So somebody forged a provenance. It was purchased for like $50,000, I think, originally. There's still a good chunk of change, right?
Yeah.
That'll pay off the looter. That pays off the looter easy, right? And all the people involved, right? They've all made their money off of this, and then some. And then it was studied and published. And once it was studied and published, it became not just a nice big piece of cuneiform, but one of the very few fragments of the Gilgamesh epic that exists.
Yeah.
Something like 30 of them that exist. And here is a nice one that comes from like 1600 BC or something like that. And from having been studied and published and identified and evaluated, its value went from 50,000 to 1.6 million.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the Greens ended up paying for it. And the part that the part that I didn't mention in the sort of my previous sort of abstract version was the role of the auction house, right? Which is, it wasn't just sold to them from a private collector. Christie's, the auction house, is the one that brokered the sale.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they're supposed to not be trafficking in stolen goods.
But
they did, and it seems like they did so kind of knowingly, or at least they knew that the provenance they had was probably not a good one.
Yeah.
But they sold it anyway. And so Hobby Lobby has now turned around and is now suing Christie's for having falsely represented to them.
Yeah.
But one of the things to remember is Hobby Lobby bought the tablet in 2014 and evidently did none of their own research into its provenance for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
Like they bought it without actually having done any of what we would consider to be the due diligence kind of work that any good collector, especially an institutional one, ought to do. Not just an institutional one who was already under federal investigation for purchasing bad Mesopotamian and cuneiform antiquities.
Yeah.
But in 2014, they were already 2 years into that federal investigation, and 4 years after they had been warned by one of the world's foremost authorities to not buy bad stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So here they bought this in 2014, and they sat on it for 3 years without asking any of the questions. But why did they suddenly start asking questions about its provenance in 2017? Because they found out that they were under federal investigation for buying bad cuneiform. So they only started the process of looking into provenance not when they got caught doing stuff with bad provenance, but when they got publicly called out.
Yeah.
And so suddenly they're looking into it and they're saying things like, oh, well, for sure we're going to, we would never have anything knowingly bad. In 2017, they realized that there was something wrong with this. But 2 years later, they still had it, and it was still on display at their museum until the federal government actually came and seized it physically from the museum. So, the whole story is one of people continuing to go along with this looted unprovenance artifact because it was to everyone's benefit to do so.
Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting that, and we spoke briefly about this before we went on air, that the narrative seems to be they get caught publicly. Oh, we've learned from our mistakes. We're paying more attention to this stuff now. It's not going to happen again. And then like a year, 2 years. I mean, this year we've had two already, not even 4 months apart. The Dr. Obbink stuff and then the Gilgamesh tablet, and it's happened again. Mm-hmm. Oh gosh, yes, of course. So 3. I was like, I don't believe that you've actually learned from your mistakes. I don't believe this actually bothers you, except that it's an optics issue.
Right. So, it's for sure true, right? They have, over the course of their now sort of 10 years of collecting, 10 years plus, they've gone through a bunch of different sort of like modes, right? There was the Wild West years. Like back in the beginning when they were, as I said, where they were buying absolutely everything, and you ended up with backpacks full of papyri and crates full of unmarked, etc. And everything goes. We'll buy everything there is, including the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then, there was sort of a transition between 2012 and 2014 or so, where they got rid of a lot of the folks who were involved in that early stage, and they brought in people who were somewhat more professional. And they said, we're turning a corner. We're not doing that. This is when they changed their mission statement. That we're turning a corner. We're going to be more like professional and real deal about this. And then they kept on doing some stuff. Like they weren't collecting nearly as much, but they were still doing some things, as it turns out, with this Gilgamesh tablet. And so there's been a constant sort of we keep on fine tuning, right? And they keep on saying, right, we're learning from our mistakes. We've learned from our mistakes, right? But you know, this is not some nonsense production. This is major money from one of the major families and corporations in the country. Like, there's no reason for them to go into in the first place not knowing what they were doing. But at every stage, as you say, they say, "Oh, now we're turning the corner. We're making the change." And scholars will say, you know, there are scholars who are involved with them who say, no, like they're getting better. They're doing the right thing now. And as you say, every time, right? There's no point yet. Like even back when we wrote the book in 2017, it was very clear to us that there was no reason on earth to trust, right? Even as they said, we made mistakes and we're learning. There was no reason to trust until they sort of were very open about everything. And they said, here's everything we have. Here's all the provenance information we have. We're going to return anything that we don't have provenance for. We're going to take the hit on all of it. Until we really do that, we trust nothing. And other people who said, no, like they're clearly. So it turned out we should not have trusted anything, because it's just been like every couple of months, there's a new object that is being returned. There's a new scandal that's breaking out. And at no point are they really taking full responsibility and saying, you know, it's always, we were duped. We're victims. And even when they do something, as to my mind, flagrant as purchasing unprovenanced and it turned out forged Dead Sea Scrolls, putting them on display, fighting very hard to show that they were real, having people publish them, even when they get caught doing that, their narrative becomes, we are on the cutting edge of science to determine forgeries. Instead of, instead of, you can learn so much from the mistakes we made, and you know, we're going to expose the people who were involved with us so that we make sure it never happens again. But what you said about optics and not really caring much, it goes back to something Steve Green, when we interviewed him for the book, and we were interested in especially this Galatians thing that was had shown up on eBay. And we said to him, look, do you have any like unprovenance? Do you have any illegal, illicit artifacts in your collection? And his response is basically like, it's possible. In other words, like we don't know, right? I don't know. We don't really check that sort of thing. It's possible. And then he went on to say, but you know, sometimes in business there are risks. And you know, he told us this story about this one time that Hobby Lobby sold it was like a Christmas tin, right? Like for holding, you know, like the kind of crap they sell at Hobby Lobby. And it turned out that it had, you know, that had been somebody else's design, and that person sued them, and they settled, and he was like, just the cost of doing business. As if these kinds of things, right? These kinds of like illicit artifacts that you have to return and you get fined for, you know, that's just the cost of having a collection and doing it.
It's unavoidable. There's nothing you can do to mitigate against that. And
it's not, right? Like it's just part of the deal, right? Like it's built into the system. The system of collecting and displaying and having a museum involves, sometimes you deal with illicit stuff and you find out and you say, okay, sorry, and you send it back. Right? Which is, you know, again, when you think about what I described as like this whole chain of illicit and criminal activity that goes back to and that supports a market, a black market in looting, in like stealing antiquities out of the ground and selling them. If people like Steve Green said, I will never buy anything that doesn't have perfect provenance,
all of a sudden the demand is gone. Yeah.
There's no looting.
Yeah.
But when it's just the cost of doing business, then of course you loot.
Yeah. That's fascinating. And actually, one of the things I also wanted to ask about was like the relationship between Hobby Lobby, the Greens, and the Museum of the Bible. Because from what I've read, it seems like in recent years, the Green family have tried to like officially step away from the museum and say the museum is its own thing. But Steve Green is still like essentially on the board, and his daughter, I think, runs part of Hobby Lobby and runs part of the museum. Yeah. So what's going on there?
Right. So this is, in a sense, this is like the great scam of the whole thing. Right, Hobby Lobby is the organization with the wherewithal to purchase the artifacts. Right, so Hobby Lobby spends its $500 million purchasing antiquities.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably somewhere in there. And now they're owned by Hobby Lobby. And then they build a museum and register it as a nonprofit, which museums are. And then they donate their artifacts, their own artifacts, to their own museum and get the tax write-off.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's not just like a convenient thing. That's actually how they got convinced to collect in the first place, was because they were told, right, you can do this and it be financially worthwhile for you. So there's something, an inherent scam that's going on there. But of course, when the news broke about the federal investigation, the first one into the big collection of cuneiform in 2017, when that news broke, Hobby Lobby, the Green family, and the museum swiftly said, this is something that Hobby Lobby and the Greens did wrong. This was our mistake. This is our purchase. These are our artifacts.
It's not the museum.
Not the museum. The museum is not involved here at all. Hobby Lobby, the museum is never named in the complaint, I don't think. It's all about Hobby Lobby. Now, before then, however, like, and really right up to then, it had been impossible to tell, right? The collection of antiquities, of artifacts, was called the Green Collection. The scholars who worked on it were the Green scholars, right? For the Green family, the people who own Hobby Lobby. And the guy who was running the museum's collection was also the person who was out looking for stuff for the Greens to buy. And it was the Green curriculum. I mean, everything was labeled with the Green name, and it was all museum stuff. And there was no clear distinction. And then suddenly this happened, and the Green name got taken off of everything. And now it became the museum collection. But what was weird was they would talk about the museum collection has 40,000 artifacts, is what their website said. But that's the Green collection has 40,000 artifacts. The museum doesn't own 40,000 artifacts. The museum only owns a couple thousand, right? 2,500, 3,000, right? The things that had been donated to it by the Greens.
By the Greens, yeah.
But so the museum collection was still just the Green collection with the museum's name on it instead. So like it emphasized that it was actually the same thing. And so just like they have kept on trying to do this in all these various ways. And like, to my mind, the new Gilgamesh tablet thing blows the doors off of the whole scam, because the government's filing about this sort of uses the Hobby Lobby and the Green family, Hobby Lobby and the Museum of the Bible interchangeably, right? Representatives from Hobby Lobby and the Museum of the Bible said, and scholars from there's simply no distinction at all anymore, which again does not change anything about the tax relationship between the Hobby Lobby and the museum that it controls and donates artifacts to. But there is no meaningful distinction between the two of any kind.
Lovely. Thank you very much. I'm going to end my questions there. We've got a few from the audience. And for those watching, I have, scrolling across the bottom of your screen, details about our next two interviews. We've got one on Saturday with Dr. Brenton Bence. Josh is going to be talking to him about the Canaanites. And then next Wednesday, I am going to be talking to... I need to wait for the name to scroll because I cannot remember Patty's last name. Thank you. Talking to Dr. Patty Gerstenblith, again about the Museum of the Bible, but looking at more of the legal side of things, and finding out what her role in this whole thing is. So it should be two very interesting shows. We've had a number of super chats. I'm not going to read them all out, but thank you all very, very much. I definitely appreciate it. And we've got a grand total of 107 people watching. So thank you all for joining us. I hope you've had fun. So our first question, how do you distinguish a forgery from the real thing?
So, sometimes it's really, really easy. Some forgers come in all sorts of levels of ability. some of them very poor, where they make all kinds of mistakes, right? If I were to pick up a piece of clay and scratch some stuff into it and bake it, you'd know instantly that it wasn't real, because I don't know how to write cuneiform. But when some of them are very, very good, and I'm sure there are some forgeries that we'll never be able to identify. But there are a few things that we look at, right? So if it's, assuming that it's a written object, so something like the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we look and see, right? Is the script look right? Does the content look right? Right? Are they using the correct sort of Hebrew or Aramaic of the time? Are they using the right kind of ink? Are they using the right kind of paper? Does the paper show the correct signs of aging? Is the relationship between the ink and the paper correct? Right? Is the relationship, so for example, if I pick up a piece of paper, if I can find a piece of ancient papyrus, let's say it has a hole in it already. Did I make the silly mistake of writing around the hole as if it had been there to begin with? Right? That's a pretty good sign. Are there errors in the language? There have been a couple of recent forgeries where it's been clear that somebody has not really known the language they were writing in, but was copying from some other text and didn't quite get the grammar or the syntax right. So there's a whole variety, and it can take, with the case of the Dead Sea Scrolls that the Greens own, that were at the Museum of the Bible, some of them were obviously forgeries because, like, famously, somebody had copied out of a biblical text and not recognized that a little mark in their biblical text they were looking at was a modern critical note. Right? There's a little alpha, right? That is like a footnote at the bottom, and they put it into their Dead Sea Scroll. Right? So like that was a pretty good indication. But many of the other ones were confirmed as forgeries, even though we all suspect them to be, until they were sort of done with like a very, very high-tech microscopic analysis of the material they were written on.
Thank you. I might be misremembering this. Did one of the Dead Sea Scrolls have a shoelace hole?
I don't remember that.
Yeah, there was some forgery recently that was a leather scroll that had a hole from a shoelace. I don't think it was the Dead Sea Scroll, but I mean things like that also. Bit of a
there's just all sorts of things that can be signs that something is amiss. It's very, very hard, if not impossible, to like absolutely accurately reproduce a 2,000-year-old written piece of parchment.
No, I believe that. And if you're looking at clay as well, you've got to consider things like neuroactivation analysis, and you can work out where in the world the clay came from. So if it's not the right kind of clay, it's going to show up under testing. So RAF4 is saying is there some social utility in purchasing legitimate artifacts from the black market in order to preserve them? This assumes, of course, that the purchaser donates them to scholars.
Yeah, this is one of the things that is commonly brought as like an argument on the behalf of the Greens. We purchase these things to save them for posterity, right, or for scholarship. Here's the problem with that argument. If you're purchasing them, they've already been looted, right? That is, the safest place for any artifact to be is buried in the ground it's been buried in for the last 2,000 to 3,000 years, right? It stayed there untouched because it was safe there. And so anything that's purchased on the black market has already undergone, right, the pillaging, the main rupture that is the thing that threatens its safety. And it should be remembered, nothing is safer above ground than under it. Museums burn, right? As we saw recently, right, in Brazil, yeah? Right, museums burn, collections get lost, right? Papyri get shoved into crates and crumbled. And I mean, there's all sorts of terrible things that can happen, right? Remembering the Dead Sea Scrolls, much as we love them, were better off in the jars in the cave where they were for 2,000 years than they are in the hands of collectors who are touching them and messing with them, as minimally as possible, of course. So no, I don't think that there is any legitimate sort of preserving. There's also, that attitude also has something of a, like, there's a little colonialism to it. Like, better for we Western white folks to have these artifacts than for the, you know, the places where they actually come from.
Mm. Thank you. Highclef says, how do you know the provenance documentation itself isn't fake? Which is a really good question, and again plays into the Gilgamesh Dream Tablet we were talking about. Is there an authority that must verify each link in the chain?
No. So this is one of the hardest things, because very few of us, certainly very few academics in this, are trained to do that kind of detective work. Right, but it is basically like straight, like, investigative detective work, right? So every provenance documentation will say, right, it was purchased from this person who had it in this person, and then it was in this collection before that, and it was taken from there, or, you know, however far back the chain may go, and it simply requires checking all of those steps as much as we possibly can. There are certain people and collections that are known to be kind of like the place where you throw dodgy provenance, right? Like, but for the most part, it's yeah. So like I said, when Candida and I were looking at the Galatians thing, and, you know, it said, you know, look, this piece came out of a sale of a lot in Christie's in 2012. And before that, it had been part of what's called the Robinson Collection, which had lived at the University of Missouri since 1950, whatever. Okay. So all we did was go back to the record of the Christie sale, where there was no mention of this fragment being part of the sort of package of stuff that was sold, which is weird, because, like, this is a fairly prominent biblical text that any person with training would have recognized, and Christie's is full of those people. So it wasn't there. And it turns out there was no record of it being in the Robinson collection either. So, like, it was, you know, the story just falls apart with a tiny bit of reading. Somebody will be able to provide a story that passes muster, even if it's fake, probably, right? But it's not like it's not as easy as it sounds. But it's the kind of work that you have to be willing to do. You have to. If you're someone like the Greens, you have to be doing that for 40,000 objects. That's a lot of work, but it's also necessary work.
Yeah, thank you. Paula Gia asks, was the debunked alleged 1st century Mark fragment controversy tied up with the Greens in the museum?
Oh, yeah. Of course it was. Of course it was. Right, the 1st century Mark fragment. The story here was that for a while there was a rumor going around that there was a fragment of the Gospel of Mark from the 1st century, which would make it by far the earliest New Testament text that we have, and like like within 20 years or whatever of its original composition. I mean, crazy. And this was mentioned by a couple of evangelical scholars in, you know, various contexts who were trying to make the point that the biblical text has been preserved. Said, oh, we have 1st century Mark. It exists out there. I've seen it, or I know somebody who's seen it. And it turns out that text was not a 1st century Mark. It was something, I think it was 2nd, 3rd century, as it turned out. A bunch of us didn't think it existed for a long time. We thought it was just a rumor. It was a real text. Dirk Obbink, the now arrested and
somewhat disgraced
Oxford papyrologist, had shown this fragment to some people affiliated with the Greens and the Museum of the Bible, before there was a Museum of the Bible. I think offered it to them for sale. And I think it's one of the things that the Greens bought, because at one point we asked Steve Green, we said, what about this 1st century Mark? He said something like, yeah, you know, when I heard about that, it was hard not to buy it. Like, I wasn't super invested in it, but it's sort of an offhand, like, yeah, that sort of thing.
Yeah, we have it. Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. That whole story. And so this is, again, I think this is something that, this was a text that I'm pretty sure is one of the ones that Obbink had taken from the Oxyrhynchus collection and tried to pass off and sell. But that was entirely came out of Obbink and the Greens.
Thank you. Jared Dassain is saying, I would like Joel Baden to say a little bit more about the specific warnings the Green family received, which they claim there's no way they could have known.
Oh, so actually, in a sense, I want to save that for when you talk to Patty
For Wednesday,
because she's the one who warned them, right? Like,
oh, fantastic! Yeah,
they brought her in 2010 before they had actually purchased the first major shipment of cuneiform they got busted for, and I mean, in her words, and she'll tell you more about it when you talk to her. She said, "I read them the Riot Act. You cannot blah 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 blah." And that was, again, before the cuneiform purchase, probably before many of the Dead Sea Scroll purchases, certainly before the Gilgamesh purchase. They got the country's foremost expert on antiquities law came in and
she told them, nope,
and advised them. So that's I'm going to leave that question as a teaser for that conversation because she's the one with the story.
Thank you. PM Atterbury says, are international agencies involved in stopping or prosecuting these thieves, whether corporate or otherwise?
I don't know whether international agencies are. There is cooperation between governments, right? The US government works with the government of Iraq, or the government of Egypt, to make sure that antiquities are repatriated. Israel's government is, works to get at the collectors. I mean, Israel has a problem with antiquities trading, and their government does some work to help there. So there's mostly sort of intergovernment. I don't know that we've got like international agencies. Part of the problem is, right, every country has its own laws about this. The US has different agreements with different countries about how we do this. And so for every country around the world, right? England's laws are going to be different from ours, and their relationship with, say, Iraq is going to be different, or Egypt is going to be different from ours. But it's incredibly difficult, and again, I think Patty Gerstenblith can speak to this better than I can, but it's incredibly difficult and time-consuming to actually prosecute this sort of thing. One of the things that you'll note about both the first cuneiform seizure and the Gilgamesh seizure is that in neither case is Hobby Lobby the defendant. Right? When you're dealing with like illegally imported antiquities and artifacts, what happens is the government pursues a case against the artifact itself.
I read the first page of that case and I was like, this is fascinating.
It's kind of weird, right? It's the US government versus 5,500 pieces of cuneiform, right? But that's just the way they get around it, because it's much harder to prove. Right? What did Hobby Lobby do illegally in the case of the Gilgamesh Tablet? Nothing really.
Yeah.
They did a lot of things wrong. They didn't quite violate the law, but we still need to get the tablet back to the country it was stolen from. So it's sort of seized by the government as if it were just something that were smuggled in, which it was. And so it's hard to prosecute the actual humans involved, in part because there's just so many steps, and you're never going to get back to the original looter. Where's the sort of original crime you're going for?
And especially if you've got something like the Green family, who are either being presented with false provenance documents or like, oh, we didn't know.
Right. There's no legal requirement to do due diligence.
RAF4 says, as an attorney, I can assure you that this manner of asset transfer, going back to the Greens giving their collection to the Museum of the Bible and then writing it off as a tax break, I can assure you that this matter of asset transfer between a corporate board or sole proprietors and a non-profit for tax purposes is neither unusual or rare. Right. I definitely believe that.
I mean, this is how museums function, right? Museums get artwork because it is worthwhile for collectors to donate it, right? If it were not financially worthwhile for a collector to give their items, to donate their items to a museum, they wouldn't do it, right? These are the people who are rich enough to own the thing in the first place, are financially smart enough to know how to manage their money well. And so this, the tax code is designed to incentivize donation, right? In the same way that it is for all charities, right? It's designed to incentivize donation, but that allows for this, this way of playing that system.
Martian 572552. Are there ways for the layman to discern if a museum deals with looters?
So the really the snarky answer is, if it's called a museum, it probably deals with
if it doesn't currently, it probably did in the past.
For sure it did in the past, right? And so this is hard, right? There are what I would say is this: the best museums have practices in place, public open practices that deal with tracing the provenance of their artifacts, right? Right, recognizing, especially long-standing ones, the British Museum, right? Places that have been collecting for 200 years have an enormous amount of material, much of which they can't figure out and have never tried, but they should be making the attempt at this point. And so, especially like older museums, what I want to see is, do they have a division, a provenance person or a division? Right, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston has a woman named Victoria Reed, who's like the curator of provenance. That's her job, right? That to me is a sign of a museum that's taking seriously, this issue, and is probably less likely to deal with anybody that way today. Remembering, museums aren't going to ever deal directly with looters. It's just a question of how good a job are they doing of making sure that they're only taking donations from, and not just museums, universities, right? Cornell, a dozen years ago or so, had a whole blow up over a bunch of Mesopotamian cuneiform texts in the same way, right? A big collection that they accepted, and it turned out the whole thing had provenance problems. So I want to see that. A new museum, one that opened in, let's say, I don't know, the last 5 to 10 years.
Not naming any names, of course. Like nothing specific here.
We're not talking about like the museum or the Museum of African American History, but other ones maybe in DC. New museums in the
maybe that deal with religious texts. Just maybe.
Those have no excuse for not, from the moment that they, sort of have the spark of the idea, have no excuse for having anything. And again, in this case, I'll even separate between the Museum of the Bible and the Greens, right? The Greens collected a bunch of stuff. The museum itself, especially being a nonprofit, right, that is to say, it's getting government support, right? Like the museum itself should never have anything on display or in its possession that is even that has
even
any
a little bit questionable.
And even when we started asking these questions, right, in 2014, 2015, right, those. But the people who were involved in the museum said, we would never have anything at the museum that has provenance problems. That was right when they had bought this Gilgamesh tablet, which they then put up, right? So who trusts any of it?
Thank you. And I want to just take this very brief opportunity. We do on occasion get emails from people saying, I found this really cool thing on eBay. Can I buy it? No. If you are interested.
And if you are the kind of person who, so occasionally I, and certainly many of my colleagues, will receive emails from people who have purchased something or are trying to sell something saying, can you tell me what this is? No, I can't tell you what it is.
Sorry.
No, but I will report you immediately to
to the relevant authorities. If you are interested in antiquities and you want to own something, I completely understand. We have a whole shelf of replicas directly behind my head. You can buy really beautiful replica cuneiform objects. I've got a replica Dead Sea Scroll urn right there. You can do this ethically. You can have something that is beautiful and expresses your interest in the ancient world that does not also fuel an issue with looting and provenance and all the issues that we've spoken about. So no, please don't buy anything off eBay that is supposed to be an actual antiquity. Just don't. No. Toothless Bulldog 2.0 says, can you ask Joel Baden what he thinks of ACTA pilot? I don't know what that is, so I'm hoping you do. Nope. We don't know.
You can ask. I don't know the answer. I don't know what that is.
And the final question is actually from my husband, and you are under no obligation to answer this because I haven't asked you myself. Question for Dr. Baden. Is he incredibly excited to come back on and provide his expertise on the formation of the Pentateuch? Please.
I would be happy to. In a sense, it's just as complicated a conversation, more complicated, but something that is less legally fraught, I suppose. So yes, I would be happy to talk about that completely different part of my life.
Thank you. Josh will be absolutely thrilled. The formation of the Pentateuch is something he is personally very interested in. And we did have one last person say, please do mention Dr. Baden's book again. So Dr. Baden published a book, as we've said, in 2017 called Bible Nation. And here is Exhibit A, available on Amazon. So I'm buying my copy. You should buy yours too. Thank you, Dr. Baden. This has been absolutely fantastic and very informative and amusing. And I think everyone else has enjoyed it almost as much as I have.
Good.
Everybody, please do join us on Saturday to talk to Dr. Brendan Bentz, and next Wednesday to talk to Dr. Patty Gerstenblith about, again, the Museum of the Bible. And until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?